and sadly, the end of GAAMAC IV's meeting on strengthening national efforts to address hate speech, discrimination, and incitement. I hope this morning you were able to attend the live sessions from the Asia Pacific Working Group and the Africa Working Group, continuing yesterday's conversations on these regional initiatives that we know are so important. You may have found time also to attend 2 of the workshops this morning, working together to create a comprehensive response to intolerance and hate crime and prevention of racism and hate speech, successful stories to prevent them, good practices and the way forward. In a moment, I'm going to give you some of the highlights from the past few days, and we're going to visualize them on Miro boards. But before we do that, let's hear from Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who sent us this video address.
Hate speech, discrimination, and incitement to hatred are among the main drivers of atrocity crimes. As recognized by your meeting, it is critical to prevent and address them. But this fundamental task is accompanied by a fundamental challenge. Across the globe, cases of harmful incitement frequently go unprosecuted. On the other hand, under the pretext of engaging in hate speech, those who dare to criticize the authorities are prosecuted. The Rabat Plan of Action, developed by my office and independent experts, sets out the right balance between protecting freedom of expression and prohibiting incitement to hatred. It provides a threshold test for states and other actors to assess statements on a case-by-case basis, both offline and online. I encourage you to follow it. It is also crucial that social media platforms meet their human rights responsibilities, notably under the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. My office has stepped up efforts in that regard, but we need further cooperation in these efforts, including from networks like the GAAMAC. I count on your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some remarks there from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And indeed, this importance, and it's been one of the themes, hasn't it, throughout the days of addressing hate speech, but ensuring that human rights are respected. So we're going to show you now some of the highlights from the past few days, and you can find the link in the chat so you can have a read in your own time. However, please don't share the document with anyone as it's not been formally approved by the GAAMAC steering group. And I'm going to take you through a few key highlights that struck me as interesting. So let's start with some statistics. 360 registered attendees from 65 countries, 65 speakers, must be a magic number, and 58% of them were women. 300 live stream views. So over the days, you'll see that we've used a color code. In light yellow, there are key highlights. In light red, the workshop highlights, and in dark yellow, the panel sessions. But as I said, in that link in the chat, you can refer to this at your own pace and in your own time. I'm just going to give you a few highlights. Now, you'll remember back on Monday, there were 2 panels. Well, I think that there was broad consensus that hate speech needs to be countered and addressed while guaranteeing and protecting freedom of expression, a message that's just been reiterated there by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Hate speech is indeed a global challenge and needs to be addressed in global multilateral fora to generate a broad consensus on how to counter it. Social media, of course, fuels, accelerates and spreads hate speech, but does not create it. This was mentioned on day one, and it's been a really common theme throughout the days about what to do about social media, because hate speech is really a triggering factor in the committing of atrocity crimes. Interestingly, most hate speech comes from state actors, and there is a clear link, studies have shown, between hate speech and misinformation. You see, there's a number of quotes there from the panels. One that struck me was from Dr. Talfik Gilassi, Assistant Director General for Communication and Information at UNESCO. And he said that addressing hate speech is a matter of national security and that we need to work together to find an effective response. In the second panel, Susan Benesch, who's the founder of the Dangerous Speech Project, said that people proliferating dangerous content don't think it's misinformation. People spreading hate speech think they're not doing something wrong. So I think that's very, very interesting. Now, what came out of day 2? Well, there was a real call for greater participation of women in politics to challenge deeply embedded patriarchal mindsets. Hate speech, as we know, disproportionately targets women, and parliamentarians need to speak out more about sexism and harassment so that this gets on the media's agenda. Violence or militarized masculinities is a very, very complicated phenomenon, and we need to focus more on the problem of impunity as a driver for atrocity crimes. We learnt that cultural acceptance of the LGBTI community remains very low. They remain among the most vulnerable groups to stigmatization, violence, and discrimination. And COVID-19 has further worsened their situation, even pushing some of them into poverty or homelessness. COVID saw a medical lockdown lead to a clampdown on political rights and freedom of expression. And all of the speakers really stressed the importance of taking a human rights approach to countering hate speech so that it's not addressed through censorship. Another key point was really about education and about ensuring that from an early age, the principles of acceptance and diversity are accepted, educating people about empathy, critical thinking, and personal responsibility, as this was shown as really to help those who are exposed to these extremist ideologies not be drawn into violence and extremism. Solutions, we heard, come from the grassroots organizations and from the Global South. And we should have the Global South telling the Global North on how to transform. So there were many quotes that were tweeted from these discussions. One of them was from the senior legal advisor of OSCE, Elżbieta Kurzborska-Pasha. Minorities, women, and women of minority backgrounds are by far the most targeted of hate speech, she said, but also they're targeted for abuse and sexual violence. This shows the need for increased integration efforts. And from the second panel, Eduardo Bertoni, coordinator at the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, I thought structured the response very well. He said, there are 2 courses of action to address hate speech. One, a punitive mode, which means prohibiting hate speech in the criminal code or other laws. And 2, a non-punitive mode, public policies such as education that we've been talking about. Day 3, well, that was yesterday, you might remember, and it was really all about regional initiatives and good practices in atrocity prevention at the international and European context. There are, as you know, 3 regional initiatives: the Africa Working Group that emerged out of GAAMAC II, and the Americas and Asia Pacific study groups that emerged out of GAAMAC III. And we heard about the importance of these regional initiatives to work on specific regional challenges, exchange good practice, and to propose concrete solutions, such as recommendations to governments for nationally owned atrocity prevention policies that complement existing regional or multilateral efforts. And there was a quote from the former chair of GAAMAC and special envoy for dealing with the past and prevention of atrocities to the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, Mo Bleicher, that really struck me. No society is immune to atrocities. So far, GAAMAC has initiatives in the Americas, Africa, and the Asia Pacific, but prevention is not just an issue for the global South. It should be a worldwide effort. Many, many takeaways from these workshops. Religious minorities, we heard, are the canaries in the coal mine. They're often the very first group to suffer stigmatization and discrimination. We heard about the power of religious figures to advance the common good, and that they really have the potential to move many people and create non-polarized spaces for dialogue. Genocide and other atrocity crimes, we heard, do not happen overnight. It starts with discrimination, stigmatization, dehumanization, and ends in extermination. Tech, we learned, of course, and we hoped, was heralded as a tool against incitement, the ultimate monitoring tool. But it turns out that it can do the opposite too. Tech has the potential to prevent risks and mobilize responses rapidly, but it was felt that so far it's not risen to the challenge. On social media, well, we learned that it should be able to sustain interest in a crisis after it has happened. And there was criticism that mainstream media reporting often doesn't focus on what happens before the start of the crisis, only the response to the crisis. And there was this big fear that as more people become digitally connected, the bigger the amount of disinformation, and that really more needs to be done to regulate social media companies and online platforms. So those are some of the highlights from the first 3 days. I know that some of you have been in these workshops this morning on working together to create a comprehensive response to intolerance and hate crime and the prevention of racism and hate speech. I do really encourage you to click on the link, which is in the chat. You'll see all of the Miro boards. I think it's a great way to visualize some of the key highlights, and you can really read this in your own time. But for me, that's all. It's been a real pleasure to moderate and to be the MC. And I'd now like to hand over to Silvia to find out some of her reflections. And of course, she's going to give us a preview of this really, really important outcome document. So Silvia, over to you. Silvia,
Thank you very much. Thank you, Claire. Thank you for walking us over the highlights of GAAMAC IV, which, as you just have said, has sadly come to an end. Dear participants, dear friends, as you may have appreciated from the compilation of the Miro board that just has been highlighted by Claire, we have had 4 days of a very productive dialogue on an extremely important and complex subject. Our plenary workshops and sessions discussions have increased our knowledge on what constitutes hate speech, discrimination and incitement as trigger factors and precursors to atrocity crimes. We have also received many doable and feasible recommendations that we'll do our best to implement at GAAMAC. As in all previous GAAMAC global meetings, a draft outcome document was being prepared to reflect the central ideas and recommendations stemming from all plenaries, workshops, and innovative square. This document will guide the GAAMAC community of commitment future engagement on these topics. As done in the past, we will share this document with all participants, and we will give you the opportunity to comment on it and or to propose further additions you may consider relevant. Then the steering group will discuss and approve the final outcome document, which will be posted on the website and sent to you all. As for now, I will share with you some excerpts of the recommendations. It is a good indicator of the quality of our meeting, and I extend my gratitude to the drafting committee for their efforts in producing this first draft, which is now shared on your screen. We will not read the entire document, which is quite extensive, but I will indicate that the GAAMAC IV identifies, in particular, the following recommendations made by our participants in some key areas. And of course, there are recommendations on one specific area of great concern to all, which was the relation between hate speech and gender. Participants stressed the need to develop a more in-depth gender-based approach to assessment and prevention to address hate speech in social media and other forms. They recommend to produce policy papers to better understand the relation between gender-based violence and hate speech, discrimination and violence, and to develop specific recommendations. They also recommend the development of training and training programs that transmit key understanding about gender-inflected hate speech within security institutions, schools, and private companies, complemented by the establishment of legal frameworks providing accountability and redress for victims. There are also specific recommendations in the area of hate speech as a trigger of atrocities. Participants agreed that there is a clear link between disinformation, fake news, and hate speech, stressing the need that technological companies and social media platforms increase their efforts to counter fake news online, developing more robust policies on the matter. Participants recommended that IRA and GAAMAC work closer together in a mutually complementary alliance for the sake of the never again to become a reality on the ground today. In contexts where atrocities are happening or have happened, participants underline the crucial importance of realizing holistic transitional justice efforts, such as establishing the facts, listening to the narratives of the affected communities, providing reparation, creating processes of administrative, legal, and restorative justice, and proceeding to institutional reforms. There were also recommendations that are reflected in the outcome document on addressing hate speech as a whole of society effort, promoting increased efforts in the field of education, and particularly education programs aimed at the global youth can and must be a key policy in the prevention of atrocities, according to participants. For this, the participants agreed that GAAMAC and UNESCO should maximize their current collaboration efforts. Participants specifically recommend to implement and maximize the opportunities offered by Sustainable Development Goal 4, notably on the promotion of good civil public understanding of these concepts through education. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights should be fully implemented as a key human rights instrument to prevent hate speech, discrimination, and incitement. Participants also urge that the GAAMAC community convene institutions responsible for implementation of the covenant. National prevention platforms, commissions, and working groups should carefully assess existing institutions and develop plans to strengthen current national mechanisms and cooperate with them in order to integrate prevention efforts into their agenda. Participants also recommended that in order to maximize its constructive potential atrocity prevention be adopted by states as a permanent endeavor. For this, participants recommend to take into account national values and domestic current needs, such as peace promotion, the promotion of fairness, of constructive management of diversity, of minority rights, and of the language referring to identity-based violence. In noting the urgency of time, participants recommend adopting timely measures to promote accountability of social media companies. Legal frameworks are urgently needed to ensure that social media companies endorse their legal responsibilities in the spreading of fake news and hate speech corporate. Global monitors that can recognize the diverse patterns and expectations of different societies are badly needed. It requires the practice of civil courage to engage in such social monitoring on the internet. In fulfilling their responsibilities to protect all citizens, participants urged states, regional and multilateral entities to include prevention of hate speech, discrimination, and incitement in their agendas. And last but not least, there is a segment of the document related to hate speech, discrimination, and incitement against minorities. Participants recommended appointing officials trained in using an atrocity prevention lens in all institutions dealing with minorities and vulnerable groups, such as security, justice, and education. Minority and vulnerable groups are under increased risk due to the surge in hate speech, discrimination, and incitement, and experience threats, or even worse, in many contexts, and in particular in Europe. In Europe, minorities, among them the Roma community, continues to suffer cultural, structural, and direct violence through mechanisms of hate speech and discrimination. Despite current efforts, participants stressed that the Roma Sinti community and other vulnerable minorities must be fully included in efforts to implement existing legal frameworks and also in education programs that may be undertaken on diversity and constructive management. Furthermore, participants call states to undersign the International Labour Organization Convention 169 and to fully implement it. Participants also recommended to tackle collective injustices that arise from historical and persistent racism. For example, through incorporating a call for reparations for Roma communities affected by the Roma genocide. Furthermore, GAAMAC, as a platform of actors joining efforts, should launch initiatives in Europe to raise moral and legal normative standards in the Council of Europe to implement existing obligations to prevent identity-based violence and promote diversity. This platform should also aim to connect these like-minded groups online to enhance connectivity and promote bridging of existing initiatives. So this is an extremely important document. This is only a preview. It has to be adopted, but indeed reflects how deep our discussions were and how concrete the outcome of many of these groups were. So now that we have reached the end of our work, I would like to thank you all for making GAAMAC IV Global Meeting a reality and for helping GAAMAC to make atrocity prevention a reality. I would like to offer my warm thanks to the members of the steering group, our partners, and the chairs and members of all regional initiatives for their continued support to GAAMAC and for their contributions to this fourth global encounter. I would also like to express my particular gratitude to the distinguished institutions and organizations that convened workshops during this fourth global meeting, as well as to all the distinguished guest experts, practitioners, who took the time to share with us their immense knowledge and experience as panelists and moderators. I would also like to thank all those who made the realization of this meeting possible and who allowed us to have an interactive and rich experience in a technically challenging virtual setting. My deep thanks to our wonderful maître de cérémonies, Ms. Claire Doole, who did an amazing job in triggering a profound dialogue and keeping us on track over the last 4 days, together with Visual Live Production, our technicians, Zonder Collective, our conference designers and facilitators, and together with the support office of GAAMAC. So I thank you all for your creative and extremely hard work. Last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to our interpreters in workshops. And above all, thanks to you all, dear participants, for your interest in a pressing topic and for your engagement in this fourth global meeting of GAAMAC. I look forward to continuing working with you, and I hope to see you all in person in another region of the world, maybe in Latin America in 2023 for GAAMAC 5. So goodbye, bientôt, hasta pronto.